Hi, Shalom, everyone. My name is Antonio Castillo. I am the Israel Liaison Officer of the Victorian Government based at the University of Melbourne. I am really excited about this panel and I appreciate your participation today. I would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which I work, the Wurundjeri people, and I pay my respect to the elders past and present. I will introduce first the Australian panelists, and then my colleague Miriam Cyber in Israel will introduce the speakers from Israel. I would like to start first by introducing Dr. Sad Awargal. He's an MD and the CEO of Cambalate. He's a key opinion leader in the clinical use of medicinal cannabis. Next, I would like to introduce Tommy Hubbard, an economist, founder, and CEO of Canatrek, a company that produces and manufactures medicinal cannabis products here in Victoria, and he produces for the domestic and international market. Next, I would like to introduce Jason Chai, a lawyer who has worked in government at the state and federal level, and also he has worked in the industry sector. Most recently, Jason was the Vice President of Government and Stakeholder Relations for the Asia Pacific region at Canopy Growth Corporation. Now I would like to hand over to my colleague Miriam.
Thanks, Antonio. As Antonio mentioned, my name is Miriam Cyber. I'm the Melbourne Biomedical Director based here at the Victorian Government Trade and Investment Office in Tel Aviv. Before we begin, I'd actually like to take a step back to a place not so far from where I'm sitting in Jerusalem, to 1964 at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, where Dr. Michal first isolated and synthesized THC. And bringing us forward to 2020, the Israel startup nation that also hosts a really innovative R&D medicinal cannabis ecosystem. So just to give us a little context and a little bit of drive and excitement behind today's webinar that we're very excited about. Now, to introduce our Israeli speakers, we are very lucky to have Michal Cotler-Wunsh, who is a member of Knesset for the Blue and White Party. She serves as chair of the Special Committee on Drug and Alcohol Use, as well as many other committees. So thank you, Michal. We also have Dr. Tamir Ghetto, who is former CEO and board member for Bol Pharma, and today serves as founder of Khan Negev, the first government-supported medicinal cannabis incubator. So thank you all, and over to you, Jason.
Thank you, Antonio and Miriam, and welcome everyone to the webinar tonight. We've got a really fantastic cast of cannabis experts, global cannabis experts in Israel and in Australia, and I'm really excited about the coming hour and a half. 2020, what an absolute crazy year. It came in rather unexpectedly. It started like any other year, but very soon COVID, of course, took over everything and changed everything that is normal in our lives. But interestingly, during the year, despite COVID, there have been a number of cannabis-related major events which have kind of flowed through the policy space. For example, in the lead up to the US election, the 5 referendums about legalizing cannabis in 5 states in the United States all passed with flying colors. So, you know, another 5 states will now join the 11 which are currently legalized federally adult use cannabis, and of course there are those 38 which have legalized medicinal cannabis. And then right before, you know, after the elections, the Congress passed the MORE Act. You know, yes, it's in the lame duck session, and yes, it has to pass the Senate, but it must be a really great feeling in the United States at the moment when you have the Democrats about to take the White House, and then you have runoffs in the Senate in Georgia, and as to who will control the Senate, and yet, you know, people forget that the major sponsor of this MORE Act bill was Kamala Harris, and you know it can only be said that she's very committed behind this particular cause. And while it wasn't a major feature of the presidential election, certainly it's something that she's very passionate about, and something that that everyone should pay close attention to once the Biden administration begins in January next year. in terms of the European Union, there was a Court of Human Rights determination around CBD that it's not a narcotic, and this was in relation to a bill that was put forward, a piece of legislation put forward by France, and it was challenged. And so it was being challenged. It was found that it could be traded across borders. So what does this mean in the European Union? And not to forget the vote at the UNCND, the United Nations Commission on Narcotics and Drugs, about a month ago. The major countries in the UNCND voted that the status of medicinal cannabis, rather cannabis, should be recognized as having medicinal effect. And there was some scheduling changes that resulting from that. What does that actually mean in terms of national legislations? And we'll discuss this during the tonight. And closer to home in New Zealand, there was a referendum on legalizing cannabis. Unfortunately, on this occasion, the yes vote failed to gain majority support. It received 48.1%. That's, as far as a referendum goes, the very first time New Zealand has ever gone to the people around this particular issue. 48% in an environment, it has to be said, that not many people discussing this particular issue. So that was a very close loss, and no doubt already there are advocates in New Zealand. There were already advocates in New Zealand which are looking at reviving this particular discussion again. And only 2 days ago, the Therapeutics Good Administration in Australia finally handed down their final decision in regards to how they're going to treat CBD, moving it from Schedule 4 to Schedule 3. Now, I think we'll have a little bit more time to discuss this, but it's been quite an incredible year. There's been a lot going on. And as a result, I'd like to take this opportunity now to introduce some of the other speakers on this panel. And can I start with you, Michal? Can you please tell me what your journey has been with cannabis, and why are you interested in this particular topic in general? And then we'll go around to the rest of the speakers.
Sure. So I'll say this, as Miriam said, actually, as chair of the Drug and Alcohol Use Committee, I actually came, to the topic from the recreational cannabis perspective. And really, I would think, the importance of, and I imagine we'll discuss that as well too, but the tensions between the medical and the recreational. And the importance of connecting the two and learning what we've learned from the medicinal, sort of process that the various countries that you've mentioned about have undergone, and how that affects and should I would say, speak with, or, certainly reflect the process that we undergo as we look at legalization of recreational cannabis or decriminalization, every country and where it's at. I'll describe a little bit of where Israel is at on this topic, and also where I think this incredible opportunity to discuss collaboration, to discuss innovation. To Miriam pointed out the importance of, entrepreneurship, scientific entrepreneurship and beyond. And we know that we're, in this Startup Nation Hub, we have strengths. We also have weaknesses that I believe, when we talk about collaboration in a global reality, different countries have different strengths and different weaknesses, and we live in a very global reality. So in having said that, and looking at issues from a global perspective that cut across, and transcend, boundaries of geography, of culture, and so forth, and affect us all. There's so much value in this kind of collaboration. I want to thank the host for inviting me to engage in this important discussion this morning. I'll say briefly, Israel has the highest rate of cannabis patients in relation to the population, medicinal. In the scope of the reform, many actions were taken in order to optimize and expedite the licensing processes in the field of medical cannabis. And the objective of the reforms of medical cannabis, the medicalization, so to speak, is to regularize the field of medical cannabis in Israel, and to make the process of treatment, licensing, occupation, and research accessible at the end of the day, Israel, or the reform in Israel, regularizes a number of interfaces simultaneously. The main ones are the licensing of cannabis treatment for medical purposes, licensing the occupation in the field of cannabis, and licensing the research and development of cannabis. And I want to really highlight that, because from the perspective of the committee discussion, I cannot tell you how important it is that we create consistent data collection processes that actually inform the policy as it evolves. That is probably the most fundamental understanding that I've received from countries that have actually legalized recreational cannabis and maybe either haven't, Colorado, or have, Canada, and how that's affected the outcome or the success of the legalization process, of the legalization of recreational cannabis process. I'll say cannabis is not registered as a remedy or as a medication in the state of Israel. It's defined as a dangerous drug, still, in accordance with the dangerous drugs ordinance in the state of Israel. And just as the Ministry of Health does not believe that a drug ought to be approved for use absent an appropriate scientific foundation of safety and efficacy, the same applies to the use of cannabis from that perspective. And so in the same manner that the Health Ministry will not approve registering a medication to treat certain diseases absent proof of the medication's safety and efficacy in treating the disease, the same applies to cannabis. It's approved solely for the indications in which sufficient information and evidence is being gathered or accumulated in order, excuse me, to reasonably assure that it is indeed helping and it is indeed safe. So I've said a lot. In summary, I'd say that the medical use is approved, and it's highly regulated for specific use and specific treatment method. It's not like going to buy Advil, as opposed to in Canada, let's say, where it is. So that's from my perspective. I do think, as I said, first of all, the incredible and important understanding, the collaboration that this kind of engagement and this kind of conversation can lead to in our highlighting our and acknowledging strengths and weaknesses of countries, and from there collaborating, improving collaborations, honing in on where we can sort of create this bridge as we tackle challenging processes are very, very important. And of course, innovation and I'll say on that as part of the committee, I really have been privy to incredible innovative ideas with regards to recreational cannabis. I'll give just one example. We don't know 100 in any of the countries actually to track the effects of recreational cannabis regulation on car accidents. So I was just exposed to an app where you self-regulate where you're at in terms of the ability to drive a car, right? Are you equipped to be getting into the car and driving? Now, of course, that takes a lot of personal responsibility. You have to create actually some sort of a baseline to assess your ability to drive. By the way, it's true for all substances, alcohol or even extreme fatigue. It's very interesting what this brings out and the processes, and the challenges that come with the process. And maybe I'll end there just not to take up too much time as we begin, and we'll engage deeper in the discussion.
Thank you, Michal. Can I go to Sud, actually? Michal makes some very interesting points about the medical regime. Can you come at this problem and give the audience a little bit of an oversight exactly how it operates in Australia?
Sure. Okay. So first of all, thank you for the opportunity to speak to this audience and to be amongst such great panelists. So quickly by background, I'm a medic. I'm a anesthesiologist by original training, and I've been involved in clinical research most of my adult life, including having the privilege at the Weizmann Institute of Science back in the early 90s. So I've experienced firsthand what a really advanced, well-funded scientific facility can do, which is something that was quite unusual. One of the things that we can say about cannabis in Australia is that is a very unique perspective, because we are a pure play medical cannabis regime at the moment, and so most of the control of what is given is really physician dictated, and so we have zero non-physician prescribed cannabis or CBD amongst public use. So things that might be treated as a novel food or a plain food or something that's completely unregulated in parts of North America or Europe are still treated as a medical physician prescribed product in Australia. So it's a really unique place. And I think
whilst there are some advantages and disadvantages on that, one of the biggest advantages are that you've got very close monitoring and very close numbers about every single patient who's on any cannabinoid product. So it does allow very, very accurate data collection, like Michal said. And one of the other good things is there's a clear matchup between which products are being prescribed for which medical conditions. So we can extrapolate and we'll say, okay, product X worked really well for disease Y. So it's unlike the Canadian system where the majority of patients are dictating exactly what combination of CBD, THC, and other minor cannabinoids they're taking. And they're often, I guess, making the decision by themselves without necessarily the blessing of their physicians about their treatment choices. So that's probably principally, Jason, what the major difference is. Very much a physician dictated system.
Thank you, Sud. And then that's a really great summary of, I guess, the way that the Australian regime, and particularly the data collection, I think you make a very good point there about the fact that, right down to the indications, we can match down to the individual patients. And I'm sure I'm sure that others on this panel keep a very close eye on the SASB numbers in terms of exactly how that kind of breaks down. And then there've been some very good analysts out there who've broken up the freedom of information data out there and be able to break down the indication. It does seem to point towards the fact that there will be an agglomeration of data, but the question is whether that will actually result in whether they'll result in clinical data or whether it will be real life data. Can I go to Tamir? Tamir, you're head of a think tank, an incubator and accelerator in Israel around this, and of course you see a lot of companies who want to innovate around this. Can you give me a view exactly how, I guess, the research landscape is going on this, and how it's moving in respect to, I guess, collecting clinical data or real life data?
Just a sec. Yeah, now I'm mute. So I joined this industry 7 years ago, and 7 years in this industry is like a dinosaur, which you can see just judging by my face. It seems like every pitfall and every problem which we encountered is cultivated on my face now. As I said in the meeting before, we took the company to an IPO last year, and when one of the big banks asked me, can I summarize the journey, which the Odyssey which I took through, I didn't know actually what to say, so I just came with a funny note. I said, listen, 7 years ago I was the Jewish George Clooney, and now I'm the Jewish George Constanza. So that's what 7 bad years can do to you. So listen, I have to say I'm intending those kind of panels. I have at least under my belt more than 100 of those. Okay. And every time the same questions are being asked, in 6 years, I was hearing the same questions and the same wishful thinking were coming across. And I have to say, I have quite a broad perspective, and I had meetings with a lot of ministries of health, and I have a good, holistic picture here. Between the Australian regime, which I think is good and very responsible, but a little bit too harsh to say, because the fact that, Sad said truly, we are aggregating a lot of data and we are collecting a lot of data, but this data doesn't have any meaning except anecdotal meaning, because it's been collected from companies which each one of them is producing in different methods. There isn't any validation. Some of them don't have GMP, but real GMP, And the fact that you are collecting data when what you are basically selling is whole plant flowers or oils doesn't mean much, because I can tell you that in most of the companies which are producing oils or flowers or any kind of other products based on THC and CBD, you see a huge fluctuation between the products. between the same batches even. And this is something which means that all that we are collecting doesn't mean much. It gives you a nice trend, but not more than that. And this is one big issue. I think, you know, the Israeli regime, the Israeli regulation, the regulators, and I think this is a very, you know, was unexpected surprise to me when I came into this market, because I'm coming from the pharma industry. And when I met all the participants at that point 7 years ago, all of them came from their high horse and said that we are doing pharma products. And I was a little bit puzzled, where is the pharma there? Because they were selling flowers, okay? So it was a very nice wishful thinking, but nothing was back up in reality. And then I approached the regulators and I saw that there is a huge, you know, openness there in research. And when you are comparing it to the United States or Canada, it's a very bizarre market, because in North America, you're allowed to sell, you're allowed to commerce, but you are not allowed to research in a way. And all the hospitals which are bound to the federal law basically cannot do much. I can give you another example. You know, I met a couple of guys at King's College and the Imperial College in the UK. For more than 2 years, they are trying to source a validated API, active pharmaceutical ingredients, for CBD and THC, and they can't find one single source which they can conduct a clinical trial based on. This is where the pitfalls in the market, you know, and it seems like the market is going to diverse into two very different markets. One is the recreational market, which we see in North America. And I think this is one business model which the North American, Canada and the United States took upon. And the Europeans and the Israelis and the Australians, I think, took another approach. And I won't go into nuances, because there are nuances between Europe, Israel, and Australia. But as a whole, we are talking about a more medical approach, much more responsible approach. And I don't want to sound like those kind of prophets, but I think that in 10 years or 15 years from now, we are going to get an epidemic, which the opiate epidemic will look like a small one compared to the cannabinoids epidemic, because you are opening the market without any control, too fast, without any sufficient data. And that was one of the reasons that, you know, convinced me, because when I came to the market 7 years ago, and I looked on the participants, I felt like, I said it once in a newspaper that said, I felt that 50% are hallucinating, 50% are dreamers, and 50% are charlatans. And there is a nice overlap between all those 150% of the participants. And I felt that in such a chaotic market, there is a room for someone that will come with a strategy in order to develop drugs. And just to, you know, just another closing remarks, we started a huge amount. It was, I think, the biggest project in Israel of clinical trials, which the biggest achievement was that we finalized a phase 2 trial on 150 kids on autism spectrum disorder in a hospital in Shaare Tzedek in Jerusalem. We took those results to the FDA. We had 2 face-to-face pre-IND meetings with the FDA, and the results, you know, were amazing, and the response was not less than amazing, and we received the green light. And you know, this is an unmet medical need, and now we are struggling in order to fund the confirmatory study in order to conduct an IND phase 3 in the United States, because this is the big money, and nobody wants to basically put any money on that, because the funding here goes to the recreational markets and not to the medical and clinical trials. And this is one of the challenges which we are struggling currently in this space.
Tamir, that's spot on, and thank you for bringing in that very pithy kind of insights in terms of exactly where the research is. And you're right, there is a bifurcation. in terms of how the markets are diverging between different jurisdictions. And right now, it seems that many jurisdictions are at a crossroads as to how they're going to choose or where they're going to choose. Can I go to Tommy? Tommy, you run Cannatrek, an Australian cannabis company, and you've done. I see from your LinkedIn profile that there's been imports from other countries, but there's also been exports. Can you tell us a little bit exactly how the industry and particularly your business is going at the moment in regards to the domestic market, and whether you think that the real market is overseas, or is it for domestic?
Thank you, Jason, and thank you everyone for the opportunity to join this very interesting panel. I think that each region really needs to look in its own backyard initially. Australia, population 30+ million. Israel, has it reached 10 million yet, Tamir? Almost. But we hear that Israel has, as you mentioned earlier, has quite a high access. Obviously, the industry has been around for 10 years. So I think at this early stage where we have to look in our back garden, there is an unmet need. There is a population. So we have to address our immediate constituency. So the export, I think, is really looking at increased commercialization for a country like Australia, who have, and also like Israel, have good climates to grow medicinal cannabis. So I think it's a two-step phase. Interestingly, that we are releasing product first export and before the local market, and that's just circumstance. But it shows that the development of that supply chain, it's the timeliness of it isn't an exact science. Not sure if I answered your initial question.
No, thank you, Tommy. And no, I think that you make a very interesting point in terms of where Australia sits and exactly where its markets are, and we're still very much in the nascent part of our industry journey. We're still building up the industry as it turns out. So we're really looking at exactly where the opportunities are. I want to go back to the point that Tamir made, though, in regards to, I guess, bifurcation. And how different jurisdictions have taken a different approach. Now, as I mentioned before earlier, the UNC&D have just come forth with a pronouncement that cannabis now has medicinal effect, which means that, as everyone knows, cannabis regulation is governed by international rules, and as countries of these and signatories of these conventions, they must adhere to the obligations. Now, with that vote and the passing of the majority of the parties, where that they recognise that cannabis has medical applications, it was taken off scheduling with some of the world. It was taken off scheduling with some of the world's most prohibited substances like heroin. Now, how do you think? What impact do you think that will have on the development of medicinal cannabis in your country? Can I start with Michal in terms of Israel? And if you could speak to your particular committee and the fact that you're chairing this particular committee, it'd be really great to understand exactly how something internationally might impact something like how you deal with it in Israel.
So part of the thing that we have to understand, and when I was referring to the global reality that we live in, and it's something that the committee delves into a lot, is how, it's not just, the different tracks that different countries have chosen with regard to regulating the medicinal components or the medicinal cannabis, but really the approach of what the indications are for the rest of the users, maybe recreational users. And, at the end of the day, part of the issues or the challenges in terms of my committee's work is that we are at this sort of unknown, very, very very, very, I would say, uncertain stage of the development, both in terms of data collection and even as Tamir was speaking, I wrote down potency and, all kinds of words that what is the data collection that we're relying on? Because we don't necessarily even know that yet. Are we tracking the right data that's actually informing policymakers with regards to not only medicinal uses for cannabis, but also the recreational components? And as we use that data, are we even, sort of considering the implications? And one of the things that comes up again and again in the committee, and you have to remember, Israel also has a compulsory military service. So I say this in terms of just, a note to ourselves as we consider this, is the implications on, I would say, the normalization and even the terminology. So we call it medicinal cannabis as opposed to recreational cannabis. I don't know any other drug, and you'll correct me if I'm wrong, that has those two. Again, I say this as a lawyer. Words have meaning. We've chosen the same word to describe the medication and the recreational use. And that is a choice. It has many, many implications, right? They affect one another very deeply. People are on some sort of a, on a spectrum of where we are in terms of medicinal affect, cultural understanding, the culture of cannabis use, and also the generational or the intergenerational effects. So when I look at teenagers, right, and the use of terminology such as medicinal cannabis and also legalization process affects the generations that are, children now, teenagers definitely, and also entering army age, and at the same time, and Sud was in the Weizmann Institute, and I've had some incredible understandings of what we know about the development of the brain, right? And we don't even know to say, is it 21? Is it 24? Is it 25 that actually leads to addictions? So I'll say when I entered my role in my capacity as committee chair, I actually chose, and Israel's politics are, we won't talk about that today, but in the uncertain times that I entered the role in, I chose to hone in and drill down through a very specific topic, that is the topic of addictions. Because I'll say in Israel, we are at a tremendous gap with the understanding of what addictions are, even of defining addictions in the same way in every single ministry, and the effects that we have in general on use of addictive substances and addictive behaviors. By the way, I don't really differentiate the implications of addiction to pornography or gaming and to addiction to substances in that sense. Because at the end of the day, if we don't have a deep understanding of addictions in the entire spectrum of how we have to deal with them, both in terms of how we define them societally, but also as legislators, and the implications of the entire network of needs that addicts have. By the way, they begin before they become addicts, right? Education and identification and professional tools that that are given to all the professionals along the way, and of course treatment, and of course post-treatment, the implications for those addicts that are continuing and re-entering society and hoping to re-enter successfully into society. Those are issues that really have been affected, but what I would say is the topic of this conversation, and that is the process of medicinal cannabis, but they really perforate out and down, and I would say have dramatic effect that we have to take into consideration. That has been the lens through which I have come to this topic. And there's even a question of which ministry is in charge of a legalization process. Is it the Ministry of Health, because it's regulated medicinal cannabis and it has the data collection capabilities and knows what it knows? Or is it another ministry that is actually going to, and that's a big issue, because one of the most important things that I think, and this is where, speaking of weaknesses and strengths of countries, that Israel lacks is an interministerial collaboration that really enables a holistic approach to any topic, certainly to this topic. So are we going to separate? The health ministry will run the medicinal issues, challenges, regulation, data collection, and so forth. And there will be another ministry, I don't know what it will be yet, that will, sort of oversee the recreational components. Will those two ministries data share appropriately enough so that we know that they feed into each other, so that we understand the effects of potency, let's say, and we started with potency, so I'll end there because it's something new I learned. The effect of potency that has changed dramatically the recreational use of cannabis. and take that into consideration and know to follow that data in order to create policy that is evolving as we enter a legalization process. So that's been a tremendous, really like a lens that's opened up for me in the last few months. Very, very fascinating. And I would love to hear, of course, everybody else's impressions of that.
No, thank you, Michal. And yeah, really fascinating how quickly things are moving in Israel. And particularly, I guess, you know, there may be global forces which are moving things, but obviously there's also local forces in Israel which are really pushing the debate. So can I go to you in terms of and getting your views on whether you think this this thing that's happened at the UNCND in Vienna, whether they'll affect, I guess, how the Australian system is, and perhaps if you wanted to comment also in particular on, I guess, the recent TGA kind of decision in regards to CBD, that'd be really helpful as well.
Sure. Okay. So at the moment in Australia, all CBD is prescribed. It has to be prescribed by a physician looking after the patient. And at the moment, there's, I guess, any CBD that comes under Schedule 4, which means it's a non-controlled drug, so it doesn't need to be signed out by two registered health professionals at the same time, and it doesn't have the same restrictions as, say, opioids would. It comes under a regular prescription drug, a Schedule 4 drug. It's got to be 98% of all cannabinoids have to be CBD only. So not CBDV, not CBDA, not any other particular type of cannabinoid, but pure CBD will form 98% or more of the total cannabinoid fraction. If it was any different to that, any more non-CBD forming part of that cannabinoid fraction, then it comes under Schedule 8, which is a lot more restrictive and needs, for example, it needs to be kept under lock and key at all times with a drug book showing the exact amount of quantities held in that particular location at once. And it needs 2 registered health professionals to sign it out, and similarly in a pharmacy as well. So it creates a lot more transport and dispensing costs associated with it. So where possible, most companies try and make their CBD Schedule 4. Now, of recent time, in the last few days, in fact, the TGA has just announced that they have introduced something called a Schedule 3 CBD. Now, this is quite unique. So there's, at the moment in Australia, there is no registered CBD product. There is Epidiolex with the FDA, that's a registered CBD product. We have no equivalent in Australia today. So at the moment, 100% of all the CBD products prescribed are done through what's known as a special access scheme, which is essentially a form of authorization where the physician takes absolute responsibility for the product. It's not something that's gone through any quality, efficacy, or safety trialing process. It's literally the physician's volition or discretion to prescribe a product that he feels is the right choice for his patient. Now, under the Schedule 3 regime, this means something will not have to go through a physician. It's going to be available directly over the counter in a pharmacy, behind the counter, but still over a counter, and will be dispensed directly by a pharmacist without a doctor's involvement. And that's what's quite interesting. So suddenly one of the major barriers to obtaining CBD is going to be removed. A patient can now self-elect that, hey, I'm going to get CBD dispensed from a pharmacist without involving a doctor, and also really with no major questions asked by the pharmacist. So whilst the pharmacist is a trained health professional, he doesn't have the ability to diagnose and make a clinical decision whether to administer or not administer the drug. So if the patient elects that they feel they need CBD, the pharmacist will simply dispense it as long as there's no major contraindications there. So this is a really huge barrier, and most people are predicting that CBD use next year in Australia in 2021 will probably be increasing by at least a factor of 10 and potentially even a factor of 100 of what it is in 2020. So it really is the first time that I guess cannabinoid use is going to be exploding in Australia. So there's already been a very encouraging growth over the last 3 years since legalization, but next year we're expecting this kind of really super exponential growth. Now, that's the good news. Now, the interesting thing is that the TGA has set the barrier for becoming a Schedule 3 registered product quite high. And one would argue that it's probably the highest standard in the world, and potentially for a good reason. So what they've said is it's got to be a product that's passed 3 major hurdles: quality, safety, and efficacy. From a quality perspective, it's got to be a GMP product that's gone through the same CMC, the same module 3 as per any other pharmaceutical product. Today, it would be very challenging. I've not seen to this day any botanically sourced product that I feel would be meeting those quality requirements with all the scale up and manufacturing products. So a little hand up from Tamir there. I, with my own eyes, have not witnessed a product that I would feel would meet the quality requirements yet. There's a few parties globally that say, yes, we've created GMP quality with minimal batch-to-batch variation. We can scale up without significant issues. We've made an API. I haven't seen it. The next thing is the safety profile. I mean, by coming under Schedule 3, the government has effectively said it's a safe product. We're not involving a physician. It's not being directly monitored on an ongoing basis by a physician. It's essentially a hand-up admission by the TGA and the Australian government. It's safe up to a fairly modest dose of 150 milligrams per day. That's a combined daily dose of 150 milligrams. Then the biggest challenge is this efficacy requirement. So you have to make a label claim. Now, this alone is quite unusual because at the moment, the only CBD product globally that makes a label claim or a therapeutic claim is Epidiolex. And that is an orphan registered product with the FDA for some very, very rare niche orphan indications, which took the best part of a decade and probably $25 million to get registered. So you have to hit a very similar hurdle where you have to now show in a statistically significant pivotal clinical trial that your product is better than placebo or better than the other competing product at meeting whatever your critical efficacy endpoint is. Now, with CBD as a sole agent, pure CBD, like we said before, there aren't a huge number of efficacy endpoints that you can hit at a 150 milligram daily dose. So it's really becoming quite interesting in terms of where the opportunities are. And I think that discovery journey has only just begun for Australian companies. So hopefully I didn't ramble on too much there, Jason. That's kind of...
No, thank you. Thank you. So that was an excellent, I think, summation, I think, of where the TGA is at and where the regime's at. And from what you've said, it sounds to me that it's, the headline's great, but definitely read the fine print. And the fine print certainly seems that it's very much putting the onus on companies to come forth with the data, particularly the efficacy data and the quality data, to demonstrate that it should be a registered medicine. Now, I'm interested in Tamir's hand up during that conversation, but before I go to Tamir, I'm going to go to Tommy and get Tommy's reaction in terms of both I guess Cannatrec's views, but more broadly the industry's views as to how they think that they will be able to meet this particular standard. And then after we hear from Tommy, I'd love to hear from Tamir in terms of whether this is a particular area of research that Israel has been focusing on, and whether there perhaps could be a connection between Victoria and Israel. But Tommy first. You're still on mute.
Okay, I'm live. Firstly, Sud, you explained it really well, the recent the change, which really happened over the last 48 hours, and you've really, I think, summarised where the challenge is. It's probably the third part is to prove that efficacy, and that I think you mentioned $25 million question. So it comes back to, is this a plan or is this a medicine? And I'm coming back to Michal. You spoke a lot about, how we actually term this industry. Is it the health department or is it the agricultural department? So it looks like we've got all these moving parts in the supply chain, and here we have this great news of a downgrading of a product which has less, I would say, constraints of access, but actually to prove it is like climbing a tall mountain. And I feel that this forum, obviously with government and industry research, is so critical to find out what are the real barriers. I mean, I'm just hearing about collecting data, So, you know, really we need a central database. And obviously I'm passing that to the government because they're the regulator. You know, if I'm collecting data and Sud's collecting data and Tamir is, and we're using different processes of how you're collecting that, it's going to be really efficient when we all come together in 12 months, say, look at the data we have. So I think that, I know you've asked me a question, Jason, and I may have gone off track, but we've got to get down to the basics. You know, we're dealing with a plant. It's a therapeutic product, and it is far quicker to market than a medicine, which is more long, more research, more funding required. And it's almost like we're straddling two types of industries in one, medicinal and cannabis, but we've joined them together. So we need to work through these challenges. And I think the TGA, although the recent news is great, I think there's going to be another iteration of how this will roll out, because I think we're going to hit a brick wall, Sud, in a lot of, you know, we might hit one of the three or two of the three. We don't get stuck at the third. So I think collaboration is, we're going to achieve it between companies and with government. And you mentioned, you know, Israel has 8 years ahead of Australia. There's an enormous amount of information and data. And you know, we've built a bridge in this webinar, which is fantastic. And I think we in Australia can glean a lot of the positive achievements from the Israel model. Now Australia has an opportunity to tweak our legislation. We've been working on it for over a year with the regulators, both in the ODC, which governs more on the agricultural side, and also the TGA more on the health side. So although I'm quietly encouraged by the recent news, I'm a bit daunted by the challenge ahead with CBD. Some people may say it's the same as vitamin C. So that's a pretty strong claim. But to make that claim, we have to collect the data. So let's collect the data correctly with the right policy, and then we'll be able to sit down in 6 months or 12 months or even a shorter period of time and really make great calls on the correct policy. Because at the end of the day, we would like to help a patient. And if the patient requires the medicine, and we have a supply chain or pathway through pharmacists, but companies or industry is restricted because potentially the cost. To me, you're looking for $40 million to do a trial in America. You know, maybe we're looking at a scenario where the government takes a bit of a more involvement in building industry, and that's something which I'm hoping to push more on a policy side, because it is such an important health issue we're facing in terms of unmet needs in the entire spectrum of the medical industry. And will cannabis perform a role? We don't know. Historically, it's been around for thousands of years, of course, but we're at the point where I think policy is really critical, and policy takes time, and this is the unfortunate challenge.
No, thank you, Tommy. And yes, policy does take time, and obviously data has to inform policy. Can I go to Tamir? You put your hand up during Sud's explanation of the system. And I'm particularly interested to go back to your point about data and addressing the issue between clinical data or RCT data and I guess real life data, which is where I guess there is a broader kind of more expanded kind of definition exactly what data can be collected. I'll be interested in understanding exactly how Israel approaches this problem and whether this is perhaps a policy innovation that can actually, you know, taking real world data and accepting real world data as the form and the basis in which certain medicines and indications can be accepted and therefore turned into a pharmaceutical ingredient. I think you're on mute, Tamir.
Now I'm on. Okay, so this is, you know, I hope I will be able to be understood because you are covering so many topics on one question. First of all, I want to say I'm happy to hear those new exciting changes in Australia regarding the CBD. I just spoke before, I said we approached the FDA with not 98, 99% CBD in terms of purification, and the impurity level is identified as well, and received the blessing of the FDA. And I'm sure that we'll get the same approach from the TGA, and we are scalable. And just to remind you, I spoke about King's College and the Imperial, which were, trying to source CBD and THC, which will be 98% and above in terms of what we are calling APIs. This is APIs. Basically what the TGA was doing, and I'm very happy to hear that, was basically to treat the CBD as an API, as an active pharmaceutical ingredient, okay? And according to API, every drug substance need to have at least, the minimum is 95%. Usually it's above 97. And because I understand the approach, because we are talking about extraction from flowers, so the impurity level needs to be even lesser than 97, because in drugs, actually the Rubicon is 95 in some of the APIs, but that makes a lot of sense. Now I understand this is a huge barrier, and the problem is that small countries like Israel and Australia are putting very high entry barriers in terms of regulation, and it's very justified. I'm supporting this kind of approach, and I think this is the right approach. The problem is that we are not playing in a vacuum, and when the money, and again, in every system, there is a balance between the government, the regulator, the industry, the financial markets, and the customers. And now there isn't any balance in this. It's not a triangle, it's more like a quadruple, but there isn't any balance because some governments are treating it as they should be treating it, and other governments are treating it very fluffy, like in Canada and the United States. The moment, Barack Obama was going through the bill, which allowed every state in the US basically to do whatever they fancy and to take it to different kind of regulatory schemes, that opened a flood, which is really hard to bounce back and close it back, okay? And this is the problem, because when we went to banks, sorry to say, it took us 6 years to do those kind of APIs of CBD and scale it up. And it took a lot of money to do it. And then we came to the FDA, and then we came very proud of ourselves to some big banks in the US and Canada and said, hey, we have the paper from the FDA. Now we want to take it to the last stage. They said, why would I sponsor you? Why should I fund you if every person, can go and extract oils without any regulations, without any GMP, without any API, and sell it in any dispensary in the US? Doesn't make any sense, because the market is so highly fragmented, and how many producers are in the States currently? More than 5,000. Some of them, I'm sure some of you saw Breaking Bad. And if you didn't, I think you should go and binge it on Netflix on your weekends, because it's a great series. But on Breaking Bad, he decided to create, never mind the details, but he had a small facility which 2 people were allowed basically to produce a lot of dangerous substance. In the US, you see a lot of small facilities which are less than 200 square meters, and everyone is doing whatever he wants. No GMP, no FDA, no regulations, and they're selling $10 billion as a whole. And when the TGA is coming and saying something right, and when the Israeli Ministry of Health saying something right, it doesn't help us as an industry, because we cannot raise the money in order to build a facility which will meet the requirements of the small regulators, which they are right, but the big money is going where the big money is. That's the problem which we have. And I will go back to another question which was raised there. there isn't any medical cannabis today. Medical cannabis is a lip service, okay? Honestly speaking, between 70 to 80%, and I don't know the exact number, but this is basically the business, is recreational, and the medical is by disguise, okay? Because I can tell you in Israel and in the United States and in every place, a huge, proportion of the people which are buying medical cannabis because this is the only way they can get it. They are trading with it, and those which are more righteous are just giving it for free for their friends, okay? It makes them very popular, so it incentivizes them to get it, but this is not medical, and as long as we are allowing to sell this product as flowers, there wouldn't be any medical cannabis because flowers are agriculture product. There will never be any medical issue in them. We are basically trying to, to grasp something which is on thin air and call it medical, but it's not medical. Okay, 100%. And this is the problem. And just give you an anecdotal story. One of my cousins just died a couple of months ago, unfortunately, from cancer, and he was hospitalized. And I'm just answering on the webinar chat. I just saw what are we recommending for patients over 80 years old with pain and so on. I won't read it all. And he was 71 years old, and he suffered from pain, and he was administered with opiates on Shiba Tel HaShomer, which is the biggest hospital in the country. And his kids approached me and asked me, because they know my occupation, and they asked me to help him. And I said, I cannot help him, you need to approach the physician. And they approached the head of the oncological department, and she prescribed him medical cannabis, and he didn't want to use it because, he never smoked and he didn't want to smoke. So we administered him oils, sublingual oils, and, it released his pain. It was a challenge just to explain him and to convince him to use it instead of the opiates. He was like a zombie while he was using opiates. And then when the physician substitute to medical cannabis, to sublingual oil, at least, he had the same reaction, the same efficacy as opiates, but he was responsive, he sat down, he could speak, he could react with his environment, with his dear ones. He died 5 weeks afterwards, but he had good 5 weeks. Okay, and that's a lot, to every person that went through this trauma can understand what I'm talking about. So I think there is, and I'm related to Tommy, I think the big money, the financial markets won't help us, and the goodwill of the legislators in the US led to a chaotic environment, which basically stopped the research of the business of the medical cannabis and to take it to the next level, because we potentially can come up with a couple of medical products, therapeutic products, for a couple of indications, but that's industry basically is reached its glass ceiling and cannot go any further because the financial markets are reluctant basically to fund those projects like the autism spectrum disorder and other projects. And I think, if the governments, if they will come, because in Israel in the 90s, there was a huge initiative of incubators. And that was the reason that I basically established the incubator in Yerucham, in the southern part of Israel, basically to substitute the financial markets, which don't want basically to take those initiatives forward. And the government in Israel sponsored the high-tech industry in the 90s, and that was the platform that basically helped to build the high-tech industry in Israel in the 90s. And afterwards, the big money of the financial markets, the private financial market came in place. But without that money, which came from the government, most likely we wouldn't see the flourishing of the high-tech industry in Israel in the last 25 years or so, which basically is what distinguishes Israel as a startup nation. And I think if, and what is basically in common to Australia and in Israel, that they are being classified as born global countries. What does it mean, born global? You don't have a real market, although Australia is 30 million also, almost, it's still on a global scale, we are small countries, okay? Tiny countries. So it's hard to justify, building something for the local market. And when you are building something, you need immediately to think about the global market and to look outside and not inside. And this is very different from the US, which, is a huge market, and they can, work at least another 20 years just in order to capitalize their own market before they're starting to go globally. And I think, this is the bond between Australia and Israel, that if we'll be smart about it, and we are talking about it a lot, but nothing really happened till now, we can bridge between those two countries, find out a bilateral kind of agreement regarding this industry in order to take a couple of projects and make it a reality, because that might, first of all, change the world. But let's talk from a pragmatic standpoint. If those two countries will be the pioneer, which will bring pharmaceutical industry based on CBD and THC and other cannabinoids, that will create a huge competitive advantage to those two countries, okay? And Australia has a very nice, story regarding opiates, because Australia is one of the biggest producers of opiates worldwide. Although it's a small country, it spotted this opportunity many decades ago. And Tasmania alkaloids and other, mentioned names, some of the biggest names in the opiates market, which is a multi-billion-dollar industry as we speak, and help the Australian economy for the last 40 years or so. So I think the cannabis industry can be at least 5 times bigger than the opiate industry. And if we'll be smart about it, that will take us forward. The defense list.
No, absolutely. Look, it sounds like there's two worlds of thought on this. I think what you've just proposed there, Tamir, this partnership collaboration is to undertake a collaboration to address the pharmaceutical market, because these are the regimes that our two countries have created. That you can't operate as a medicinal cannabis company unless you operate as a pharmaceutical company, and because of that, as Tommy has kind of summarized, it's going to be very hard to do so, because the data, there's no flexibility to interpretation of how that data can get a particular medicine registered. But I'm interested in the other world, the other world being the US world. If the US was to legalize adult use cannabis and was to enable the creation of a single market in the United States, what moral persuasion do you think, or what moral suasion do you think the United States decision to do that will have on markets like Israel or Australia, and whether by creating this moral suasion, and if there is policy change in Australia, whether that means in effect that medicinal cannabis ceases to exist, and then suddenly we all just migrate into this new world, which is where the United States is at. Michal, can I start with you?
Well, I think Tamir referred to it, and I think we already see the implications, right? We see the tremendous effect of the choice that the United States has made, Canada, North America has made on the rest of the world. I certainly see it here, feel it here. There is no longer a discussion of legalization, yes or no. There is legalization how, right? It has to be responsible. It has to be something that we understand, identify the gaps, first of all, that the state of Israel already has in this regard, as I referred to through the lens of addictions, for example, but many others, of course, and the ramifications of, what that means in terms of now enabling a legalization process. And by the way, I didn't share at the beginning, but actually the current Minister of Justice appointed an interparliamentary committee which submitted its recommendations reasons. And actually in the decriminalization versus legalization model, one or the other, where Israel, again, I didn't sort of go into too much detail on that, but Israel chose the path of decriminalization a few years ago. And actually this recommendation goes, I'd call it all the way, right, to legalization for many reasons. And I say this actually as a lawyer, for many reasons, there is, if you're going to go that route, there are many, many good reasons to choose the legalization option, because the decriminalization only resolves half of the equation, rendering the rest of the equation sort of unattended or closing our eyes to the implications of what decriminalization means. There are many legal reasons to prefer legalization, and medical reasons and educational reasons. There are many reasons. But I think that we already see the effect of, you know, what your question refers to, and that Tamir spoke about. And the implications are tremendous. And where I would actually sort of at least take caution is with what we see as, you know, the opiate pandemic in North America, and understand the implications of not leading a process in a way that is actually in a global reality. And also, and we didn't really speak about that, though I've spoken about it in other forums, in the reality in which information travels at the speed, the magnitude, and the, let's call it inaccuracy, for lack of a, you know, stronger word, the inaccuracy that it travels. When you take all that into consideration, you understand that there are tremendous implications to North America making the decisions it has made, it is making. And now as a legislator, and I'll say this, and I say this consistently at the committee, my job is actually to look at reality and identify it for what it is, not to sweep under the carpet what doesn't suit me, and not to ignore it. My job is to take responsibility, and I believe to be held to account for recognizing reality for what it is. And I want to say something about this this incredible panel, and where it highlights what I've come to recognize in my committee work in general, as this committee, as a committee chair, but in general in committees. What I think is also happening, and I imagine it's happening worldwide, and I'll say across topics. So as I said, you know, this interparliamentary task force to combat online anti-Semitism, in theory, it couldn't be any more different than the discussion we're having here today. But in fact, it's completely connected. I think that we have as governments to shift the paradigm in terms of what our responsibility is in the changing world that we live in. And when Tamir speaks about the collaboration, and even when we speak about data collection, there also is an element of data sharing and data sharing, not just for the record, sharing because we understand authentically that only through this kind of engagement between countries, but also between, I would say, technical, academic, and drill down knowledge bases. So look at me, here I am a legislator, and every time I have this conversation and I like to delve deep into the conversations, I realize how little I know. I am a lawyer, I am a legislator. I sit around the decision-making tables, and I need to hear the voices I'm hearing on this panel in order to make an informed decision. So the viewpoint diversity that comes from this kind of engagement, cross-country, and as Tamir identified, countries that share, it's not just interests, it's beyond, that share, you know, the deep values in understanding and approaching these issues, have, I would say, a responsibility at this point of time in our global development, in recognizing global challenges and how they affect all of us. So the decisions in the United States or of Canada affecting Israel and Australia on this issue, that to me is not only an opportunity, but a responsibility that we have. And in one more, I'll finish with this, in one more way, I think that the follow-up to a panel like this is actually, and this is what happened with online anti-Semitism, following a committee hearing I held regarding online anti-Semitism, is the implications and the importance and the imperative for us to collaborate, us being parliamentarians, to utilize the opportunities we have to engage in order to create legislation that's not only for our own countries, but that takes into account the implications of our decision-making, of our legislation on other countries.
Thank you, Michal. Can I go to Sud on the same topic, same question? To what extent do you think the US, if they were to go down that path, will have a moral suasion in terms of how Australia would interpret this? And then after Sud finishes, we're going to have one last question for everyone in terms of the future, and then we're going to go to questions of the public. Sud?
Yeah, look, it's a really interesting question, Jason, and it's quite hard to answer. I guess one thing we can reflect on is what happened in Canada after they went from a pure play medical market to a market that then allowed recreational use in October 2018 now. So we've had a couple of years of knowledge there. And we can probably draw a few conclusions. So number one, we can say, I guess the interest of patients wanting to go through the full medical process, seeing a physician, getting an authorization card, getting a prescription grade product, that reduced quite considerably. In fact, many people have said that the recreational market cannibalized the medical market. And that's an awful word, but that's what people have been using. And number two, it then created this whole genre of websites, self-diagnosis tools, where patients try to marry up, their medical condition with a particular strain or a genotype of the plant. For example, people would say, I've got rheumatoid arthritis, I need purple kush, orange superbud skunk flavor. And that was the kind of the marry up. There's a highly unscientific process that people were using about trying to work out disease is X, product is Y. And those two sort of shifts, probably were more deleterious, I think, than beneficial. But probably the real kicker, I think, for me is, so I'm heavily involved in medicinal cannabis research. We've got 14 RCTs going across a whole variety of different products, orphan products. And I'm the chairman and a professor of a CRO in Melbourne. But one of the things that probably really would be the kicker for legalization for recreational use or adult use is that it pretty much dries up the opportunity to do cannabis research. The minute you go to a full recreational or adult use market, you've suddenly, I guess, you've lost the financial advantage of getting a medical product through the registry hurdles to registration, because I guess there's no financial barrier to just buying it over the counter as a recreational product. And it pretty much killed all forms of research funding in Canada, certainly, and in the US. The quality and the caliber and the volume of research happening there is so much less than is happening in Israel and Australia. So ironically, people were talking about this, I think Tamir mentioned about the small populations of Australia and Israel. Ironically, the volume of research and the commercialization of novel drug candidates coming out of those two countries are far in excess and far superior to that happening in the US and Canada, which is really a reflection of the fact that we are pure play medical environments. So,
thank you, sir. That's great. I think Tamir, I see his hand. I think he wants the right of reply. Tamir, over to you. Still on mute.
Can you hear me? Oh, good. So basically, I totally agree with what Jasad said. I think when you don't have any differentiation, because when you see the conversation, if you go to a Canadian dispensary or a Californian dispensary, you will see kids there, which I'm sure didn't finish Harvard Business School or Harvard Medical School, or not to say anything bad about it, but without any professional skills, which are talking, and then comes a nice lady, and I was there and I witnessed it myself more than once, and you see a nice lady comes inside and said, listen, I have fibromyalgia. And this is something which happened to me. And he took her to 2 jars and he said, listen, you see, smell that. And you see the flowers are purple, and the flowers are brownish. And see the smell, this is for fibromyalgia. This smell is exactly what you need to take to fibromyalgia. And I couldn't even stop laughing there. And they pushed me out of the store because they thought I'm a barbarian, an Israeli barbarian, but it was so funny to see it, and it wasn't the first time I was encountering those kind of behaviors. So the moment, and it will happen in every country that will react like that, the moment you're opening the recreational markets, the medical market will die, period, okay? Let's not be naive about it. This is one issue. Now, the problem is, and I see it even in Israel, the moment recreational markets are happening, you don't have any differentiation. The entry barriers are almost none. And because of that, the world is going in cycles. The next stage will be the real therapeutic industry, okay? And the people which will be smart about it and will start to put money into research for 3 to 5, 6, 7 years from now will benefit from this jump in the market, okay? Because you will see that, you know, what will happen is that there are a lot of fragmented companies in the North American markets that are going into conversion as we speak, okay? Because they don't have any real differentiation. What can you argue? My cannabis is greener than yours. You don't have any real differentiation in your business, okay? So it's economy of scale. There are going to be a lot of conversion. A lot of companies are going to die because the cost is dropping heavily, and there are no patents and there are no IPs, and you don't have any entry barriers. The moment you will come with research, with IP, with real products in the market, that will make a difference. And I will just want to give me another 30 seconds. You know, we signed a deal with 3M. 3M is a big name. And this is one of the 4 biggest meter dose inhaler producers in the world, okay? And we are developing a meter dose inhaler, like an asthma inhaler with propellium. And hopefully it's going to be ready in 2022. And figure to yourself a product which is based on a real meter dose inhaler, a digital counter, which is going to be based on real clinical trials in 2 indications, which we are going to initiate next year. This is something which can revolutionize the space in the coming years. And I think, you know, companies that knows how to do real research, that can find the partners in the pharma industry. And there is a strong pharma industry in the Australian market, and there is a good pharma industry in the Israeli market. And I think, you know, if you can bring funding to those with matching money from the government, which will incentivize real companies to go into the space from those 2 countries, I think that will make a difference in the long run.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Tamir. That concludes, I guess the question and answer part. My very last question to the panel involves the future. 10 years from now, 10 years from now, where do you see the world in your country on cannabis? Can I start with the Australians and then we'll go to the Israelis? Tommy, do you want to start with that one? I think you're on mute, Tommy.
Okay, I've just unmuted. So looking into the future, 10 years. So
sorry, short answers. 1 minute each. 1 minute per future.
So we will see the supply chain divide into growers, educators, researchers, policy, and also the supply chain. So as long as those parts are taken care of, we will have a viable industry. Where do I see it? The growers may stay growers, or they may go further upstream and develop research, education. Like a lot of the companies like ourselves, we're vertically integrated. So I think my hope is that the whole supply chain will grow and be successful. For that to happen, we really need the policy to be sorted out now. The sooner the better. And we're hoping that government will realize that supporting research, which seems to be the real barrier, will have far more input. And whether it's dollar for dollar, you know, we have a lead time before commercialization, and that is the major problem. It takes time, and we need to have that time to perform the viable research.
Thank you, Tommy.
Thank you.
Sud?
So yeah, look, I agree with many of the things that Tommy just said. I see the market differentiating into a series of different market segments, and with companies specializing in those market segments. Probably I see manufacturing, production, clinical research, and prescribing clinics. I think those three being the major segments in the future. I would imagine at 10 years' time, we would have a whole suite of validated, medically registered products on the TGA and the FDA, and they would be available for doctors to prescribe for specific conditions. I also think, certainly judging by what's happening in the world today, there'll be a whole array of orphan products for rare diseases where cannabinoids and fixed dose combinations of cannabinoids with other drugs are solving major medical unmet needs. And yeah, I think that's the general picture that I see. It's going to be very much physician-led, very much medically prescribed targeted products.
Yeah, it sounds very specialized if it's getting down to orphan conditions. Can I go to Tamir and then we'll finish with
So I would say the defining moment in this industry is going to be when GW patents on Epidiolex and Sativex and so on are going to expire in 2 years or so, because what we are going to see is that there is going to be a growing recreational markets in a couple of countries. Bear in mind that the European region is not part of this play as Australia and Israel. I think this is part, there are two, it's a binary kind of world. I think in 3 years from now, the generic industry is going to jump into the CBD market because the PDLX patents are going to expire, and then they're going to make 505(b)(2) kind of registration of different, on spasm and different seizures-based products on CBD. That in turn will create more money to flow into this market, and 10 years from now, I think there will be some niche products in the CBD and THC based products for orphan diseases and unmet medical needs. I think there is, it's going to play in 3 waves in the coming decade or so. And I think we are going to see an exciting industry evolving, which is going to be more than $40 to $50 billion. And those who are going to play smart, are going to build a nice economy for the coming 3-4 decades from now.
Thank you, Tamir. Michal?
Yeah, I of course, first of all, have learned so much from everybody here today and look forward to continued engagement. What I would say in the next 10 years, or what 10 years from now will look like, is really in our hands. And I say this from of course, from the perspective of a legislator. And I think that if we identify the opportunities alongside the challenges, and maybe I'll end where I began, each of our countries have strengths and weaknesses. And I think that this, one more thing that highlights the strengths and the weaknesses of our countries in a very, very concrete way is the discussion we're having today. I think that for Israel, there are tremendous opportunities to identify its weaknesses and actually address them. And I'll say, in terms of, we've spoken about the data collection and the effects of, data collection on policy and the effects of policy on continued data collection. And also, and I'll say this as a country that's only 72 years old, so maybe we still have the privilege to say it, in terms of a country that needs to learn to plan long-term, to create long-term holistic plans that are interministerial, that involve collaboration between ministries and between countries. And I think that there's tremendous opportunity here. And in a decade, if we successfully identify those opportunities, including the opportunities for this kind of collaboration and the importance of these collaborations also obviously affecting the cross-country fertilization of this issue and beyond, then we can see a tremendous benefit of the process that we're discussing this morning.
Excellent. Thank you, Michal. And I think that's going to take us up to our time. Unfortunately, we've run out of time for questions from the audience, but I'm told by the organizers that we will collate those questions and then we're going to send those questions to the panelists so that we can answer directly and then get it back to the individuals. If everyone's okay with that as panelists, yeah? See a lot of nodding heads, great. So thank you everyone for your time tonight. We've gone the full hour and a half in terms of really fascinating conversation. We started with major changes which were happening in the world. Then we did a deep dive into exactly how the different markets of Australia and Israel deals with medicinal cannabis. And I think we got a really rich conversation there in terms of how the systems deal with medicine and what it seems, what it classifies as medicine. And I think what we kind of realize is that not only is there, I guess, a disparity in terms of how information or data is collected and between how the manufacturers want data to be collected versus how the regulators want data to be collected, but also how in the end there are different markets and how they've kind of treated it. Fully going for the recreational space versus staying a pure medical. And it was really insightful, I guess, to ask both the Australian and Israel side to see what the future looked like. And it seemed to me that at least on the Australian side, they both wanted a rationalization and a specialization in terms of the various parts of the supply chain and not going fully integrated. And then being even more specific about the medical, whereas Tommy, I think, is talking a little bit more broader in terms of where and Michal as well, thinking a little bit more broad as to exactly where medicinal cannabis can be and how ultimately it will be driven by capital. And if it's not, if there's going to be an evolution, it will come from that. So thank you so much, everyone, for the opportunity to be able to talk with you all on this very, very fascinating, very contemporary topic. I want to thank the organizers again, the Israel-Australia Chamber of Commerce, University of Melbourne, and also Global Vic for hosting us on this webinar. And now I'll hand over back to you.
Thank you, Jason.
Thank you.
Sorry,
Go
I'll
ahead,
say
please.
a quick word before Antonio will close up. Thank you, everyone, today for your participation. Our hope was to bring together global thought leaders on this topic, and I'd like to think that we achieved that. And when I reflect on the discussion today, my biggest takeaway is really in terms of collaboration, and not just the need for the global collaboration, but what was noted as to the interdisciplinary collaboration, and just seeing the dynamic today between the different kind of pieces of the puzzle and the importance of the learnings, and how, when we look to the future and we want to change the future and we want an impactful future, this is really key, both the international collaboration as well as that interdisciplinary engagement. So thank you, everyone, and over to you, Antonio.
Thank you, Marian. Just a few words. Thank you very much for an amazing panel. Thank you for sharing your knowledge. For me, from my angle, I'm very fascinated about this opportunity, because as it was clearly discussed and dissected here, data integration, data sharing, data management is really a driving force, not just to drive technological innovation, but also to drive innovation into policy making, because of course we need to work from the different perspective. And another opportunity for Israel and Australia to work together in digital technologies and all what is in terms of cybersecurity. So many angles for collaborations. I thank you very much for all the attendees. Please reach out to us. You can find us in LinkedIn. Here we are, Miriam and myself, and of course the panelists. We are here to facilitate this interaction, and we're really looking forward to seeing you in another panel in the future. So thank you very much and have a good night. Shalom.